This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This particular episode is going to be our 2021 finale, if you will, about a group of fairies known as the Bhavan Shi. Now, the Bhavan Shi are Scottish in origin, and the name is spelled Baobhan, and then the last word is Sith, which I think since various later permutations of Star Wars, people want to say the Sith, but no, it's actually pronounced Shi. And this is a reference to a type of being that is vampiric. Okay, these are fairy vampires. Now, the Bhavan Shi, the way I would like to approach the topic of the Bhavan Shi is first to tell you a couple of stories. They're all very similar stories, but I will start with one in particular that I have from I'd mentioned my Time, Life, Enchanted World series books that I'd gotten in the 80s. So I'm going to tell the Bhavan Shi story that they mentioned there. And then I'm going to go over to Wikipedia because there's a couple other variations that are mentioned there. And then I want to get into the idea of their origins. First of all, what their common attributes are, and then what their origins are. And then how we can see what these different attributes might mean, and what these figures might represent in terms of the dark feminine. So, okay, so let me start with the story I have here. I'm opening my book here. I feel like I'm getting ready to sit down and tell a story. Like I should have, we should be sitting around a fire somewhere. I should have, reading this to a child at bedtime. Okay. So the story is, I'm going to read it here. Excuse me. A man named McPhee once related how he had hunted on a winter's day with 3 companions in the Western Highlands. Evening found the party many miles from home, and the men decided to take shelter in an abandoned shieling, the rustic lean-to used in those parts to shelter sheep during the summer grazing season. The men built a small fire to roast the rabbits they had caught, and the dark little hut soon grew pleasantly warm. The whiskey jar passed from hand to hand. Presently McPhee began the lilting, wordless humming called Puertabil, which Highlanders enjoyed. His companions rose and danced in the darkness to his melody. Round and round they danced, clumsy with laughter and flushed with drink. After a while McPhee paused for breath, and his companions, red-faced with exertion, paused too. "You trip a bonny measure," observed McPhee. "Aye," replied one of his companions, with a leer and a wink, "and wouldn't it be bonnier still if we had pretty maids to trip it with us?" Outside the shieling the wind rose, a hound howled once, and the hunters' horses stamped and whinnied. Then the door blew open. The men turned quickly at the sound, and were astonished at the sight it heralded. 4 lovely maidens, all clothed in green, stood at the entrance. One of them fixed with McPhee with a bright, red-rimmed eye. With the little clicking steps she minced to his side. She put her hand on his shoulder and nodded, and willy-nilly he resumed his singing. His companions, blank-faced as if enchanted, began to dance his measure, but they were slow and awkward now, for each was held fast in clinging arms. The maidens danced with them. Not a word was spoken. The only sounds were the clicking of the women's feet, the leafy rustle of their dresses, and the reedy hum of McPhee's dancing song. How long he sang and how long his fellows danced, McPhee could not tell. At some point, however, the song dried in his throat. The women's mouths were fastened on the necks of his friends, blood bubbled at the pretty lips, and spotted the men's shirts. With a howl, McPhee bolted. Out the door he ran, into the night, into the woman who had stood beside him following. He could not shake her. He later swore he had seen her feet, and they were the hoofs of a deer. He felt her breath on his neck, and her fingernails dug into his arm. He wrenched free and dashed among the tethered horses. For reasons he did not understand, she seemed unable to approach him once he was among the animals. There he stood, leaning on their warm flanks for the remainder of the night. In the darkness he heard her footsteps and hissing breath, but all such evidence of her lurking presence faded with the morning light. Not until the sun was well up did McPhee stir, however. He left the horses cautiously, looking around him all the while, and peered into the shieling. The fire was out, the little space quite dark. McPhee stepped in and saw his hunting mates. They lay on the ground, pale, bloodless corpses. The ragged, bitten flesh on their throats was crusted and dry. Such hauntings and killings were not uncommon once, and everywhere the pattern was the same. Vampires seemed to seduce their victims, most of whom submitted helplessly to the predatory embrace, as if enspelled. Some vampires drained their prey at once, some took a little blood each night, so that the men and women they feasted on wasted slowly. Okay, so this gets into other types of vampires. For our purposes, we are only interested in the Bhavan Shi. And so here's another version of the tale. In this one, refers to McPhee. It doesn't use McPhee's name. It used McPhee's name for a different version of the story. In another version of this same tale, it says that one of the men noticed that the women had deer hooves instead of feet, and as soon as they saw that, rather than dance with them, they fled. Or in this case, the person who is McPhee, he notices it before, and then that's when he runs. And then he finds that the others had their throats cut and their chests laid open, because another attribute of the Bhavan Shi is not only that they drain your blood, but that they rip your heart out. And in the third story, it says hunters took refuge in a cave. Each man of the men said he wished his own sweetheart were there that night, but one of them, also called McPhee, probably a mix-up of these stories, who was accompanied by his black dog, said he preferred his wife to remain at home. At that moment, a group of young women entered the cave, and the men who had wished for their sweethearts were killed. McPhee was protected by his dog, who drove the women from the cave. Okay. And as they mention here in the Wikipedia article, one recurring motif is that the Bhavan Shi almost always appear after the hunters express their desire for female companionship. This is connected with the traditional Scottish belief that if we're one to make a wish at night without also invoking God's protection, that the wish would be granted in some terrible manner. Okay, which is also consistent with fairy lords, the idea of, you've heard the phrase, be careful what you wish for. And that even can go back to a certain degree to Dionysus, if we think of the story of King Midas, who is granted a wish and asks for a golden touch. So Dionysus says, okay. And then, of course, everything he touches turns to gold. His food, he goes to hug his daughter, she turns to gold, everything turns to gold. So he has all this gold, but he's starving to death, and his loved ones are dead now, or turned to gold. So he begs Dionysus to take this away from him, which Dionysus does grant, but he gives him the ears of an ass to show just how idiotic he was about the whole thing. So, there's this idea of be careful what you wish for, but there seems to be another. It's particularly interesting that we're talking about men who are longing for their sweethearts. Okay, I think that's an important trait there. So speaking of traits, let's talk about the traits of the Bhavan Shi. Okay, so this is from Exemplar.com. They say, of course, they mention that the Bhavan Shi are from the Scottish Highlands. That's where they're supposed to be found. Okay. And they mention that this ghost vampire was always deemed to be dangerous to humans. Now, okay, first of all, we have the idea of them being a ghost. Just like we said with Black Annis, is this a ghost or is this a fairy? Or is this one of those cases where the fairies and the dead are mixed up? Okay, so what they have in common with the classic vampire: they're creatures of the night. They drink human blood. They may sometimes have fangs like the classic vampire. They're seductive. They can't tolerate daylight. They can shapeshift into other animal forms, and they are telepathic and can read thoughts. However, there are differences. The Bhavan Shi will only rise once a year from her grave. According to this, other names include the White Woman, even though they usually wear green. The vampires are all female. They stalk their prey in forests and other natural locations. Oh, and by the way, let me stop and just say, green, we always think of as a color associated with quote-unquote horniness, okay? So it's so it's something to think about there. They shun society, keeping to rural areas, but hunt in packs, okay, like wolves. Interesting to note. They've been known to invite men to dance with them before attacking. They use their extremely sharp fingernails to draw blood from the victim rather than fangs. When attacking, the nails are said to turn into talons. Some are said to have cloven hoofs for feet that are hidden under their long dresses. A man bitten by a Bhavan Shi will not turn into a vampire. He's just simply dead. Any woman who is attacked and killed by a Bhavan Shi will return as one of them. Building a stone cairn over their grave was thought to stop them from rising. Iron is one of the main weapons used against them. They are afraid of horses, particularly if the horses are shod with iron shoes. Therefore, anyone who remains sitting on their horse while confronting the Bhavan Shi would be safe. Okay. And they're saying there's numerous stories, and of course, they all seem to be versions of the same one. I'm just trying to see if they have a... yeah, they don't. They, of course, they say numerous, but they don't actually give any examples. But generally, it's young men trying to escape from them. So as we looked at that tale of MacPhee, which he could not understand why he was protected by the horses, probably because the horses were wearing iron shoes, and they could not... it may not really be the horses that they're afraid of. It may actually be the iron shoes that they wear. So, okay, so then the question becomes... what is the origin of the Bhavan Shi? Where do they come from? Now I'm looking at Leanne Gallagher's, she's an author who's also writes about mythology, folklore, etc. And she says, where do these creatures come from? Some believe that they are actually the original vampire, predating Carmilla and Dracula. Although, as she mentions, that's a little bit hard to believe because it seems like the story of Cain as a vampire, the biblical Cain, as well as the Lamia, are probably more credible potential sources for the origin vampires. Yeah, there's a difference, except Lamia is generally portrayed as being rather ugly, probably more of a Lilith figure. Because if they're very attractive, then they're coming, you're not talking about an old hag who's attacking you at night. You're talking about a beautiful, seductive woman. Okay, so that's an important difference. Now, she mentions, the possibility of being like the Scottish version of the Maenads. Okay. And she also says it's possible they were once deer goddesses who were punishing those who hunted without performing the appropriate rituals. Okay, which again kind of gives us a connection to Artemis, who was actually said to slay young girls, potentially, if they threatened, losing their virginity. And that, actually, it's almost like a reverse Artemis in a way, because Artemis did not want young girls to lose their virginity. And this is almost like the men who lust after the women are punished for lusting after women. It's a different way around, as though lusting after women in some fashion is going to kill you, is going to drain you of your life. And I think there's a more archetypal origin to that. But okay, the Maenads, if I didn't explain, are connected to Dionysus. They are the followers of Dionysus, and they are notorious. They're not really notorious so much for drinking blood. They are notorious for attacking and tearing animals and sometimes people to shreds in their frenzy, in their ecstatic frenzy. So there may be these bands of wild women running around tearing things apart. That may be where there's an element of that, but at the same time, I would not quite say that a Maenad is a vampire. It's more like a combination of the Maenad, maybe with a figure like Lamia. But the really curious part to me has to do with the connection to lust, especially if we're talking about a legend that's very, very ancient. I mean, certainly by the time we get to the Christian era, we can understand that kind of morality appearing in a lot of these stories. But certainly, I would say in what we think of as Northern Europe at that period of time, I don't know. I'd be curious to know what the oldest reference would have been to the Bhavan Shi, but it's not mentioned anywhere. I've not been able to find in the research when the first Bhavan Shi story was told. Probably, again, if it was an oral folk tale that was told, who knows what the origin of it was. But I'd be curious to know if they're saying, quote-unquote, ancient is for how many, is it 1,000 years ago? Is it a few hundred years ago? I mean, when was this legend initiated? Because that might give us a clue as to maybe what the mean. Well, not that all tales have to have a meaning, but generally they are expressing some kind of truth about nature. In this case, like a lot of the fairy tales that we have, and when I say fairy tales, I literally mean tales about fairies. There tends to be, we can see a possible component of warning against danger, what I like to call didactic. in the sense of there's a lesson to be here, See, kids, this is why you don't do X and Y, This is why you don't go over to those water things. This is why you don't play in the forest at night. And, stay out after dark. There's like a warning tale there. What this seems to be warning against is, warning, in this case, in some cases, you're talking about men who just want the company of beautiful women. In other cases, they want the company of their own sweethearts, not of, they're not looking to go to the local brothel or strip club or, strip club, not in those days, right? But, it's not that kind of a thing. So it's very interesting what that might be saying there. Yeah, I was just looking at another one from the Scottish Herald where they talk about the Bhavan Shi as devouring their male victims and ripping out their hearts. So there we actually see the devouring theme again that we've seen with hag figures. Okay, and of course, in at least one of these, they said, well, yes, the reason that the men don't turn into vampires is because there's nothing left to them. Although in the version that we just heard, the bodies were there, but they were completely drained of their blood. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, here's another little account from Spooky Isles. They said they talk about the story of the weather turning bad. They're playing music, and then weather turns bad. They decide to take sheltered and deserted Bothy for the night. One gentle tapping at the door later, 3 beautiful women who just happened to be on the remote hillside begged to join them for the night. As you might have guessed, the fun really starts at the obligatory invitation over the threshold. Another aspect of vampires, by the way, they have to be invited in. One of the women then begins to play an instrument while the others dance, and the men can hardly believe their luck. But it is in fact a death dance ending in a bloody dismemberment for 3 of the 4. The lucky survivor unwittingly protecting himself with an iron coal scuttle. Okay, so this is another version. Iron, we are told, is the Bhavan Shi's kryptonite, so all the garlic and pointy stakes in the world will not cut it as protection. And they do not take a dainty little bite out of your neck, promising to come back for dessert later. They'll have the whole neck, thank you very much, not for not asking, and there will be no danger of you coming back because there won't be enough left of you. Okay, so... so it's, so this is, so we're looking at a particularly vicious kind of vampire but also there's the idea of cannibalizing too. It's not just drinking of the blood. It may start with the drinking of the blood, but this is really a kind of a cannibalizing figure. And so I find this this vampire / succubus kind of idea because this is a really interesting example of it because we're mixing together the idea of the seductive female, like the succubus, usually that is draining the life of men in a sexual way. In this case, they're dancing. Now, dancing can be a metaphor for sex, okay? But the idea that they have the wish to spend time with these beautiful women who embrace them, okay? However you want to take that. But these are women with the feet of deer, okay? Now, what do the deer represent? What do the deer feet represent? Well, for one thing, the idea of having beautiful women with the feet of animals in some kind. We see this in, we see something like, for example, there are different, like certain versions of Lilith, for example. She's said to have the feet of a bird. Okay. In what we think of as demon lore, if you read the Goetia, a lot of demons have these feet that are, what they are is they look like a normal human, and then until you look at their feet, and then the feet are something else. Like I said, they belong either to a bird, or they belong to a deer, or they're cloven hooves, like you would see on a goat. There are some other British fairies, well, English fairies, shall we say, that meet that description as well. That have the face of a beautiful woman. But actually, if you look down at their feet, the feet are your connection to the earth, and the idea of the feet being different is, so it's saying foundationally you're something other than, what you appear to be. but also the feet are, that's kind of the source and the ground, and the fact that they are animal feet suggests the connection to nature. Okay, that we are talking about natural forces or animal spirits. Deer in particular seem to be connected in a lot of these mythologies to the underworld. Okay, there's the idea of the there's a number of tales if you look up deer in mythology. There's quite a lot. Mystical stags, the white deer or the white stag. You have, sometimes they're associated with fairy. You have the image of Cernunnos, for example, in the Celtic. And a lot of times, too, you will see people who are turned into deer, or you see fairy figures that take the form of red or white deer. So they are, so there's definitely an enchanted. Deer is one of the main sort of shape-shifting forms that you see. And so the fact that they have the feet of the deer, as somebody also mentioned, it may be connected to a deer goddess, or if we think about the Native American, the deer maiden, who was mentioned in another one of the podcasts. I think she was compared to one of the other hag figures, or one of the other ones that seeks to that helps, that makes I'm not thinking very well today. They get lost, like where somebody going into the forest and seeing this maiden. If somebody is not treating animals the proper way or doing rituals the proper way, you might have this maiden who comes and in this apparently beautiful form, but is actually very destructive, or who leads a person astray. So, and the deer sometimes is what we want to call, is the catalyst in many folk tales for something starting. Someone sees a particularly beautiful deer or unusual deer and runs after it, or is going to hunt it, and then ends up getting farther away into the woods, and then it changes into something else. And, this is a very common element. So the deer feet, yes, they're a giveaway that these are women connected. They're liminal. They're not entirely human. And if we remember what we said about the Aori, a lot of times they said that these restless spirits could, they were either into a bird, usually like a crow, or a wolf. And the similarities with wolves here, too, cannot be underestimated in spite of the deer feet, okay? Because they hunt in packs like dogs or wolves, okay? So there's this idea of this rather wild and vicious nature. They hunt in packs. You never have one Bhavan Shi hanging out by herself. There's a group of them. So what do we have? So we have this, this motif of the, you definitely see the underworld connection there. It becomes very obvious in that moment. And of course, if you associate it with the demonic as an element of the demonic, which frequently is what happens, at least, since Christian times, then there's like a sort of extra layer of malevolence there. But again, the question for me is whether or not these beings predate, and if perhaps they were something else at another time, or that they become these kinds of seductive vampire kind of figures who are very destructive. It's also, by the way, worth noting the role of blood. If we think about going back to that theme of the restless dead, one of the things, if you remember the Odyssey, when Odysseus encounters Circe, she takes him to a cave where he needs to summon the spirit of Tiresias. And to do this, he has to slaughter a black, I want to say it's a black lamb that he has to, it's either, I can't remember if it was a sheep or if it was a different kind of an animal, but he slaughters a black animal, and the blood pours down, that's the way sacrifices in the underworld, the blood coagulates, it pools down. And what the dead do is they rise up in the cave, they drink from the blood, and then they're able to speak. So blood has a very strong connection to life. Okay, so the idea that they're feasting on life. These are female figures that feast on life. and the blood is actually required for them to speak and to act. So this is something that empowers them in some way. And you also have this act, but it's even more than drinking blood. It's this total act of devouring. And so, again, the devouring feminine, the feminine that's going to that's going to overpower you and that's going to destroy you as the individual. In this case, as the man that you are. This almost goes back to Freud's fear, fear of castration and things like that. The idea of being completely devoured by the feminine is also it's a type of, in this particular case, it may be a type of castration fear. Because you have this feminine force that is going to completely annihilate you, okay? Which goes back to the idea again. These are appearing as beautiful women, but they serve the same role as the hag, in that way. They are, there's an annihilation there of the young man who is perhaps looking to reproduce, feeling his oats, looking for. Would love to have my sweetheart here. I'd love to have a little action. I mean, yeah, maybe they just want to have a little dance, but. They may want something else too. And so, in other words, when they are sexually aroused and at a point where perhaps you could fulfill that function of potentially of expansion, you have two people who unite. Instead, these are women who come in and instead of providing that, they stop the process. They cut the process dead, literally. They put a stop to that. So, to me, I look at this and I put all of this together. And I start to wonder if we're not really looking here at a story of, and again, another anima story, only has a very, very negative connotation. Now, when I think about some of the early writers like Hesiod and those who wrote at his time in ancient Greece, there were a lot of the writings that probably came within 100 years after that. Some of these earliest writings that we have from ancient Greece. There's quite a lot that's written about wives. At least one version of the ages, the ages of man. You have the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age. At least one of them, I think it was the Iron Age, refers to. It basically talks about women and just talks about just how horrible they are. Okay, how the worst thing a man could do is to marry. And all of the terrible guiling things that his wife does to him and so on and so forth. This is a form of misogyny that we've seen, it's been around for quite a long time in different forms. And some of these men who are particularly grouchy about certain things, don't seem to do very well with women, tend to have, you tend to see a lot of that in their writings. And the more rational and aesthetic the writings, obviously, the less favorable women appear. But I find this just very, very interesting because it's basically completely emphasizing, it's a complete embodiment of the negative anima, of the anima that can paralyze you, can inject you, and really, at worst, could destroy you. Like the man who falls in love and the relationship, or pining for the relationship just completely wastes the person away. You might compare it to Medusa, and in fact, in Heinrich Fiers's book on Jungian psychiatry, he talks about the state of being in Medusae. Young men who become suicidal when they break up with their girlfriends or otherwise. And what they are is they're quote-unquote turned to stone in the Medusa effect. So it's like some monstrous feminine has stung them, and now they are paralyzed. Whether or not it was connected initially with a female or not, but it was interesting in a lot of these cases that it's, after a relationship had failed. And so, but it demonstrates that negative aspect of the anima, that idea that the paralyzing effect of the archetype. And it's something that many people experience. Now, if you're living in a society with arranged marriages, okay, and many of them were, and again, I'm not sure what the situation was in Scotland at that time. I'm not sure what the custom was at the time a tale like this would have come up. But, the idea, of course, wanting to marry for love rather than for position or, influence or something like that, because that was always, marriage was not about love. That's a very late development. But it's almost a caution against that. This is what happens when you lust after somebody, when you fall in love. It's just going to have the life completely drained out of you. It's going to ruin you. Okay? So there seems to be a metaphorical element there. But the archetype can do that to somebody. You can lose, lose yourself over somebody. You can lose your head over somebody too. And it can happen to women or to men. But in this case, they are definitely talking about the anima as a force that, rather than allowing the man to be creative and to act as a partner, instead just completely drains him of all ambition and of all life, and literally of all life in this case. And in which case it does seem to resemble the succubus, the way in which your lust is going to kill you. Your lust is going to destroy you. Instead of that lust being seen as, if you're gonna look at it from a strictly procreative standpoint, that should be a good thing, right? And certainly, usually we don't see this kind of negativity associated with men, with sexuality. The woman who is sexually free is a whore, right? Yeah, that's the way they act. Like, oh, the woman's the whore. Men who are sexually free might be called players, but generally speaking, they're feeling their oats. Like, I've seen this actually happen. I know people personally who have been in situations where, they, at 13 years old, they were seduced by a 16-year-old guy, and they both had sex, and, she ended up pregnant, and, she was a disgrace to her family. But to him, they were like, hey, good job, son, so there's definitely usually that. So this is interesting because it almost more like what they do in those abstinence education videos where they say, if she comes at you and she's dressed seductively, you just run. That one crazy lady who does those. I can't think of who she is, but Pam somebody. I can't think. She's an absolute, complete and total nutter. But she's, doing these abstinence things, but it's always, watch out for her. She's trying to seduce you. She's going to take your virginity and she's going to ruin you. It's like, ooh, but that's just it. They're aroused, and it's never their fault. Okay? So in a way, it's almost like the idea of, it almost becomes an embodiment of he was enticed. They'll say with women, well, it was the way she was dressed. It was the way she was, she drew him in. What was he going to do? Well, he could have not done anything. But, it almost seems to be an embodiment of that, just as we see the fairies being embodied as blame for other kinds of disasters. Here we have it as being, the disaster of being led astray by that seductive woman, and how it's just going to absolutely finish you. You're going to be mincemeat to her. She's like some kind of demonic thing that's going to devour you. So very interesting mythology, or really folktale, that seems to point the idea of being faithful to your wife, to being prudent, to not giving in to physical urges. But this one seems to be aimed at men, which is not something that you only. It tends to be more common the other way, but it is extremely common in the idea of woman as temptress, as woman is who's going to lead you. And of course, if this is a myth or a folktale from the Christian era, then certainly it's the idea of how this Lilith-like figure, if you will, is seeking to bring about your ruin through her loose behavior, through enticing you into loose behavior, and is actually just going to bring you death. So something there to think about. And again, like a lot of things, I hear a lot of different folk tales from Scotland. I'm always curious to know if there's some story floating around out there. It's somebody who thinks they encountered a Bhavan Shi. Again, I'm not saying that I think they're real, but like anything else, I don't know. So I always encourage you, if you have a real story, if I tell these little folk tales, I give you the kind of archetypal view on it, or the psychoanalytic view. But if you've heard of somebody who says, no, I actually saw one, I'm interested to hear. Just because I'm always curious. I'm always curious to find the balance between the strictly folktale fantasy or metaphorical view of something, and the potential of does this relate to anyone's real experience. So with that, I'm going to stop this for this episode. I want to thank you again very much for listening. We should have some more good podcasts coming up in 2022. and that list should be available fairly soon. Please visit Chthonia.net for all my other works. In addition to my podcasts, I have publications, I'm giving classes, all other kinds of things. And if you want to support my work, please visit patreon.com/Chthonia. And I want to thank very much all those who currently support me. I very much appreciate your support. Please check me out on social media, Chthonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Twitter and Instagram, and just Chthonia on YouTube. Thanks again so much. See you in the next episode.